Rodrigo Díaz de Vivar was a Castilian knight and lord of medieval Spain. Born a minor noble in Castile in the 11th century, through his abilities as a leader and skill in battle, he rose in prominence throughout his life. His ultimate achievement would be taking back for Christendom the city of Valencia from its Moorish rulers and making himself master of the east coast of Iberia. This was a time of immense conflict between the Christian and Moorish kingdoms, desperately battling for control over the peninsula. Notably, Rodrigo won renown fighting for both the Christian kings and also for their Moorish enemies. This magnificent soldier won battle after battle, often against enormous odds, earning huge riches and eternal fame. He became an icon not only for his feats of arms, but also his many virtues. Widely regarded as the ideal medieval knight, he was strong and brave in battle, and just and pious in peace. He was respected by his enemies and loved by the loyal knights who flocked to his banner. In the centuries since his death, the life and deeds of Rodrigo were told and retold until his story grew into legend. But if he's a hero of Christendom and a symbol of the Reconquista, the long reconquest of Iberia from the Moors, why did he spend part of his career fighting for Muslim rulers? What motivated him to fight so relentlessly and to take immense personal and political risks throughout his action-packed life? Why did he fall out with the powerful king he served? And what was it exactly that made this man so admired for over 900 years? This is the incredible story of Spain's greatest hero, Rodrigo Díaz de Vivar, the knight known to history as El Cid. Rodrigo Díaz was born in the mid-11th century, likely about 1045. It's accepted that he was born in Vivar, a village near the town of Burgos. The exact details of his parentage aren't entirely clear, but he was a member of the aristocracy, and his family had links to the upper echelons of the local nobility. These kin networks led to him in the year 1058, as a boy of 13 or 14, entering the service of a son of King Ferdinand. This kind of fostering was a standard practice throughout medieval Europe, helping to reinforce social and political alliances across generations. Rodrigo was joining the sphere of the most powerful Christian ruler in Iberia. His new master, the young Sancho, was the eldest son of Ferdinand I, sometimes called Ferdinand the Great or the Magnificent. His greatness had come from his gradual extending of his authority from Count of Castile to becoming King of Leon through diplomacy and war. Castile was a hard land that bred tough people. Its landscape was high and bare, although more heavily wooded than today, with large untamed tracts teeming with boar, wolves and bears. In the wilder places, there also roamed outlaws who preyed on unwary travellers. But extensive efforts by the lords of Castile on settling the land in the early medieval period had established farmland and vineyards, herds of horses and cattle, and modest but busy towns like Burgos. After Ferdinand secured his own position at the expense of neighbouring Christian rulers in the north, from about 1060 onwards, he turned his attentions to the neighbouring taifas to his south. The Moorish Muslim conquest of Iberia in the early 8th century led to the establishment of Al-Andalus as a powerful, united caliphate. This had collapsed in civil war at the start of the 11th century, with the taifas emerging as independent Muslim states. Their disunity and relative weakness allowed Ferdinand to raid the taifas of Toledo, Badajoz, Seville and Valencia to conquer territory from them, for example Coimbra in Portugal in 1064, and also to extract vast amounts of money in the form of tribute. This tension between the Christian rulers and the Moors would continue to feature throughout Rodrigo's lifetime, and for centuries afterwards. The Reconquista, the long reconquest of Iberia from the Muslim invaders, would take another 400 years to be completed. But this era, the duration of Rodrigo Díaz's life, would be one in which the Christians were often on the ascendancy. The taifas were still a threat, but also presented opportunity. King Ferdinand had 2 daughters and 3 sons, 2 of which Rodrigo would serve in his lifetime. Young lords destined for power like Sancho, Ferdinand's eldest son, were surrounded with other aristocrats to be his companions in life and in battle. They would be educated in the proper way for aristocratic boys, learning to read and write and learning the law. And indeed, Rodrigo was literate and as an adult would be appointed by the king to hear lawsuits. They would also undergo martial instruction in riding, combat, command and learning strategy and tactics. Young noblemen across Christendom were raised on the legends of saints and the tales of heroic deeds performed by their ancestors. These martial virtues were reinforced by a robust Christian morality. Rodrigo clearly excelled in all these activities and disciplines during his youth. His talent and loyalty to his lord Sancho became evident early on, and he soon rose through the ranks until Rodrigo became Sancho's most trusted follower. There would have been a retinue of men serving Sancho, just like all kings and their sons, some of them younger to provide friendship, some older to provide guidance, and all of them looking for advancement, all striving to excel above his peers. There would be camaraderie and brotherhood, but also jostling for position as the top man. Any one of them could have come out on top, but it was Rodrigo who achieved it. We don't know details about this period of Rodrigo's life, but we can assume that he was already displaying the virtues and abilities that he would become famous for: intelligence, reliability, and martial excellence. Rodrigo was knighted by his lord probably in 1062, when Rodrigo was about 17 or 18 years old. You can see that right from the start, our hero was an ambitious man. He first gained his martial reputation in service to Sancho, and his earliest campaign demonstrates the political complexities of the era. King Ferdinand had forced the Taifa of Saragossa to pay a rich tribute to Castile in exchange for its protection. When Ferdinand's brother, King Ramiro of Aragon, took a small town in Zaragozan territory, Ferdinand sent his son Sancho to assist Al-Muqtadir, the ruler of Zaragoza, in taking it back, and Rodrigo went with him. During the deciding battle, King Ramiro was killed. Supporting a Moorish ally against a fellow Christian king, and a brother no less, might seem strange to us, but such were the complex political realities of the era. Rodrigo must have performed his duties ably, but as is so often the case, the details of this part of his life in service to Sancho are unclear. Soon, however, his deeds would emerge into history. In late 1064, Ferdinand attempted to take the city of Valencia on the Mediterranean coast. However, he was stricken with an illness that would soon prove fatal, and he withdrew his army back to Leon. When Ferdinand was nearly at the end of his life, he called his family to him and told them how he would divide his lands and responsibilities between his children. To his firstborn Sancho would go Castile, to the second Alfonso would go Leon, and the third son Garcia would get Galicia. The annual tributes from the taifas of Zaragoza, Toledo, Badajoz and Seville would also be divided between his three sons. Ferdinand asked his sons to swear to honour this division, but Sancho alone refused. He believed that uniting these kingdoms had made his father strong, and allowing them to be divided once more would weaken them all, and what's more, would weaken Christendom as a whole against the threat of the Moorish rulers. When Ferdinand died in 1065, Sancho went to war against his brothers in order to win all his father's lands for himself. It was now, as Sancho's right-hand man, that Rodrigo truly established himself as a gifted military commander. In 1068, the brothers Sancho and Alfonso fought on the border of Castile and Leon at Lantada. It was agreed prior to the battle that whoever won would also win both kingdoms. Sancho, with the help of Rodrigo, defeated Alfonso. However, in a move that revealed something of the man's character, Alfonso fled, and the war continued. In 1071, Sancho marched into Galicia and defeated his youngest brother Garcia. In 1072, Sancho and Alfonso met in battle once again, and this time the clash was far more decisive, leading to the capture of Alfonso and his exile to Toledo. One of the main medieval sources, known as the Historia Rodrici, a 12th century text on the life of El Cid, says the following of this period, Quote, King Sancho valued Rodrigo Diaz so highly, with great esteem and affection, that he made him commander of his whole military following. So Rodrigo throve and became a most mighty man of war, and Campeador in the household of King Sancho. In every battle which King Sancho fought with King Alfonso at Lantada and Golpejera and defeated him, Rodrigo bore the king's royal standard, and distinguished himself among all the warriors of the king's army, and bettered himself thereby. End quote. Sancho, ruler of Castile and Galicia, now crowned as King of Leon, was now the most powerful ruler in Iberia, and had shown himself to be the true successor to his father's rule. With Rodrigo at his side, there were no limits to what they could accomplish. However, before he could set his sights on grander tasks, he had a smaller problem to take care of. Some of the Leonese nobility refused to swear allegiance, and so Sancho, with Rodrigo, marched his army to Zamora. Here, the rebel aristocrats gathered their forces, perhaps under Sancho's older sister Urraca, who ruled the city, perhaps at the urging of the exiled Alfonso. The Historia gives us more details about Rodrigo. Quote, when King Sancho besieged Zamora, it happened that Rodrigo Diaz fought alone with 15 enemy soldiers. 7 of them were in chainmail. 1 of these he killed, 2 he wounded and unhorsed, and the remainder he put to flight by his spirited courage. Afterwards he fought with Jimeno Garces, one of the more distinguished men of Pamplona, and defeated him. He fought with equal success against a certain Saracen at Medina Theli, whom he not only defeated but also killed. End quote. We know then that he was courageous and skillful, a young man willing to take risks to make his name and establish a reputation, to win fortune as well as fame. As the victor in such combats, he would have been awarded ransom and battle gear. Armour, horses, saddles, lances, good swords and so on were expensive, as was funding servants to support a knight in peace and in war. It's possible that it's at this time, in service to Sancho, that he came to be known by the title Campeador. This comes from the Latin campi doctor, meaning teacher of the military field. It had been an old late Roman position for something like a drill instructor, but it was revived in this era and applied to Rodrigo during his lifetime, in recognition of his position as a leader of men. Of course, he came to be known to history more commonly as El Cid, meaning the Lord. This was adopted from the Arabic word Said, a term used for him by the Moors he fought with, against, and eventually ruled over. But Rodrigo's good fortune was not to last. One night, while King Sancho's army laid siege to Zamora, so the story goes, a nobleman assassin made his way into the camp and assassinated Sancho. The details around Sancho's death are unknown, but what we do know is that Rodrigo had served Sancho for 14 years and had risen along with the king to become a renowned knight and soldier. His fortune had been tied to Sancho's. Now his lord and master was dead, and for the first time, Rodrigo did not have a clear way forward. It was the nature of the medieval world that all men had to have a lord to serve, all men except kings, and the new king would be the man that Rodrigo had recently defeated in battle. It would never be an easy relationship. There are rumours in the legend of El Cid that Alfonso had had a hand in his brother's treacherous assassination, and that Rodrigo had suspicions about his former enemy. However, Alfonso VI of Leon, Castile and Galicia would, over the next 37 years, go on to be an enormously successful and respected king, and by all accounts he welcomed his brother's man into his own court. Quote, after the death of his lord Sancho, who had maintained him and loved him well, King Alfonso received him with honour as his vassal, and kept him and his entourage with very respectful affection. End quote. 2 or 3 years into service with his new master, in 1074 or 75, Rodrigo married the lady Jimena Diaz. This was no doubt a political union arranged by Alfonso to help bind the famous young soldier to him and his kingdom. It seems Jimena was a cousin of some degree to Alfonso, and a marriage like this was equal parts reward and leash. To the newly crowned Alfonso, Rodrigo was valuable for his ability in war and the loyalty that he inspired in others. But these traits could make him dangerous too, especially if Rodrigo were to swear allegiance to a foreign rival, or to join a hostile faction, or to sow discord within his own kingdom. In theory, a marriage to the king's distant cousin would make all that far less likely. However, Jimena would prove to be a loving and loyal wife to Rodrigo throughout his life, and even after it. They would have 2 daughters, Cristina and Maria, and 1 son, Diego. Perhaps wary of Rodrigo's potential to cause trouble, Alfonso kept him close, but did not give him authority in military matters. The king did campaign during this time, invading Navarre, and perhaps Rodrigo accompanied the army, but he was not given a chance to win renown. Instead, he was used to adjudicate certain legal cases on behalf of the king, such as a dispute over grazing rights, and another on the ownership of a monastery. Many men would be quite content with such a life, to be a courtier for a good king with land and income and a good marriage with healthy young children. But it seems that Rodrigo, the former military commander, chafed a little in such a domesticated courtly setting, and his yearning for action could not be contained. In 1079, he was sent by Alfonso as an envoy to the Taifa of Seville to collect the tribute due for the king. While he was there, the ruler of the Taifa of Granada launched a raid against his enemies in the lands of Seville. The invading force contained both Moorish and Christian forces. Some of these knights were also envoys from Alfonso, sent to the court of Granada to exact tribute. Now, to understand what happened next, we need to remember that Seville was under the protection of Castile. That was what they were paying the tribute for. And so Rodrigo, as one of the envoys, took it upon himself to ride out with his own Christian knights and Moorish forces from Seville to meet the enemy. It was really a conflict between the Moors of Granada against those of Seville, utilising detachments of Christian knights loyal to their overlord, Alfonso of Castile. Those Christian knights on both sides had sworn to defend the taifas they were visiting, and so they each rode out against one another. You have to wonder if this was a cunning Moorish tactic to drive discord in the court of Castile. Anyway, the resulting skirmish was rather inconsequential militarily, but it was won, of course, by our hero Rodrigo. What's more, he took for himself some distinguished captives, including 3 powerful lords of Castile, his own peers in the service of Alfonso VI. He took their military equipment for himself as ransom and sent them on their way before ultimately returning north home. The humiliation he had inflicted on these great men caused Rodrigo trouble at court. A jealous faction began to agitate against him. A few years later, in 1081, he once again took it upon himself to take military action without royal authorization. A huge raiding party of bandits plundered Castile. They had come from the Taifa of Toledo, although they were supposedly not commanded or authorized by the Moorish ruler, who was an ally of King Alfonso. In fact, this large-scale lawlessness was surely a sign of the ruler's weakness over his territory. El Cid's response was swift and brutal. As the Historia puts it, quote, "He gathered together his army and all his well-armed knights, and pillaged and laid waste to the land of the Saracens in the kingdom of Toledo." End quote. He supposedly rounded up 7,000 captives, taking all their wealth and possessions, and drove them home with him. Now, these reprisals against lands under the protection of his king had not been authorized. Rodrigo was acting like an independent warlord, and his actions threatened to undermine the agreements with Toledo and risked further escalation. If the Campeador was not punished, then it would seem as though he had the king's backing. At the urging of the enemy factions at court, Alfonso commanded that Rodrigo be banished from the kingdom. It's at this point that begins the other main source for the life of Rodrigo Díaz, a text known as El Cantar de Mio Cid, usually translated in English as the Poem of El Cid. It likely dates to the middle of the 12th century, a few decades after the event it describes. It's a wonderful epic poem that is based in truth, but also contains exaggerations and literary flourishes, full of detailed descriptions and emotional dialogue that bring the story to life. In many scenes of battle, Christian knights charge their Moorish foes with pennants fluttering on their lances, battle cries are shouted as thundering hooves make the ground shake, shields are broken and blood is spilled. It's not only one of the major works of Spanish literature, it's really great stuff. The poem begins with a dignified Rodrigo weeping at his banishment as he says to himself, "My wicked enemies have contrived this plot against me." He rides slowly through Burgos with his loyal knights in tow, as the townsfolk weep to see him go. None could offer him lodgings or sell him goods on pain of punishment from the king. Rodrigo and his knights must pitch their tents and camp in the wilderness like outlaws. Sadly, there are no contemporary descriptions of his appearance, but throughout the poem of the Cid, he is often called Cid of the Flowing Beard. Where could he and his loyal men go but to seek another lord and master? However, he had few options. After all, most of Christian Spain belonged to Alfonso, and the rest didn't want to displease him. Rodrigo was in a terrible bind. He led a force of hundreds of dedicated knights, along with their servants and families. They had loyally followed him into exile, doing their sworn duty to honour and obey their lord. But he was in danger of failing to uphold his part of the agreement, to protect them and to provide for them. Without land and income, they would not survive. They would have to dwell in the wilderness as true outlaws, making raids against towns and fortresses, turning Rodrigo into a masterless warlord. And indeed, they did this for a while as they rode eastwards in their exile, taking a fortress and ransoming it back to the Moors before continuing to ravage the countryside. But such a way of life, making everyone into an enemy, would hardly be sustainable forever, and would ruin Rodrigo's chance for ever returning to the civilized life of a nobleman. So he led his wandering army eastwards to Catalonia, where he offered his services to the Count of Barcelona. However, he was rejected. Not only that, for some reason the lords of Barcelona insulted Rodrigo and drove him away. With nowhere else to go, he turned to the Taifa of Zaragoza, ruled by Al-Muqtadir. He had been ruling for 35 years and was one of the most powerful lords in Spain. Al-Muqtadir was a learned man with interests in philosophy, astronomy and mathematics, and he was wise enough and confident enough in his position to welcome Rodrigo with open arms. El Cid would serve this court for 5 years, between 1081 and 1086. However, the elderly ruler quickly died and power was divided between his two sons, Al-Mutamin and Al-Haib. Of these, Rodrigo served the new ruler of Zaragoza, Al-Mutamin, as a military commander, and his new master would employ him to fight against both Moorish and Christian enemies, including the King of Aragon and the Count of Barcelona, and Al-Mutamin's own brother, Al-Haib. These three great lords united to attack the borders of Zaragoza, and El Cid was to command its defence. Rodrigo was outnumbered and not at all confident, trying his utmost to avoid battle. But the powerful enemy alliance forced an engagement, and, to everyone's surprise, El Cid won a magnificent victory. He captured the valuable baggage train, and even better, he captured the Count of Barcelona and his retinue of knights. This was the same Count of Barcelona who had recently rejected Rodrigo's offer of service. This victory at the Battle of Almanar won the Cid vast riches and fame, and it cemented his place at the court of Zaragoza. In 1083, Rodrigo would lead devastating raids through Aragon, drawing its king out into battle in 1084. Once again, El Cid was victorious. More than that, when the enemy forces broke and fled, Rodrigo pursued them and captured many distinguished lords of Aragon. With these incredible victories, he had proven himself the most exceptional soldier of his day. Yet events elsewhere would overshadow these victories. Alfonso VI besieged and then captured Toledo, the ancient capital of the Visigothic kingdom. After 370 years of Islamic rule, Toledo was back in Christian hands once more. Alfonso was inspired by his great achievement into even more reconquests, installing a puppet ruler called Al-Qadir in Valencia, sending raiding parties deep into Granada, and himself leading an army to Zaragoza and laying siege to it. One of the defenders of the city was El Cid. It seemed as though Alfonso was about to crush one Taifa after another and drive the Moors into the south of the peninsula. But it was not to be. In Al-Andalus, the Taifas were disunited and weak, but across in North Africa, the Berber Almoravid dynasty was powerful. The Taifa rulers long valued their independence and feared losing power to their co-religionists across the sea, but they were on the verge of losing everything to the Christians already, and so they appealed for aid. As the ruler of Seville famously put it, quote, "I would rather be a camel driver in Morocco than a swineherd in Castile," end quote. And their call for aid was answered. A vast army from North Africa under the Almoravids crossed to Spain and was intent on the reconquest of Toledo. Breaking off his siege of Zaragoza, Alfonso clashed with the North African forces at the Battle of Sagrajas in October 1086. He was resoundingly defeated. This crushing blow changed everything. In the face of this new existential threat, old conflicts suddenly seemed inconsequential. The defeated Alfonso needed all the help he could get, and so he and El Cid were reconciled. Fortunately for the Christians, the Almoravids did not immediately follow up their success. Instead, they rushed home to Morocco to deal with a dynastic succession crisis. But they would certainly return to finish what they had started, and so Alfonso moved to secure his positions in preparation. One of his decisions was to welcome El Cid back into his service, granting him the power, prestige, and opportunities he had denied him before. Rodrigo was given a series of castles to secure in the Duero Valley, as well as more fortresses in the far north of Castile and Briviesca near his homeland of Burgos. As well as the responsibility to rule and defend them, he was granted the rights and incomes to these lands and their people. This at once raised Rodrigo to the highest ranks of the aristocracy. The king's generosity is a sign of El Cid's importance as a commander who could organise and lead men, and inspire their devotion. He had also proven his ability to be victorious in seemingly unwinnable battles, something Alfonso, fresh from defeat, no doubt valued highly. An indication of El Cid's value to Castile also comes from an extraordinary right granted to Rodrigo at this time. Alfonso agreed that, quote, all the land or castles which he himself, meaning El Cid, might acquire from the Saracens in the land of the Saracens should be absolutely his in full ownership. Not only his, but also his sons and daughters and all his descendants." End quote. This unique concession, extracted from the King of Castile, shows just how ambitious Rodrigo was. He knew he could defeat armies and take cities, and he meant to use these skills not just for the king he served and for Christendom, but also to establish a dynasty of his own. I think it's moments like this that show Rodrigo was not just a pious and loyal vassal, as asserted in the poem of the Cid, but a man who considered himself an equal, or almost, to kings. After all, he had known personally many rulers by now, and he had even defeated his own king in battle many years before. Good men always flocked to serve El Cid, and he well knew his own capabilities. Why should he not rule a kingdom of his own one day? It was a dangerous time for Christendom in Iberia, but Rodrigo meant to turn it to his own advantage. For the next couple of years, Rodrigo saw to his duties, and in 1089 he was sent to relieve Valencia. Alfonso had installed his puppet ruler Alcadir in exchange for regular tribute, but he was an unpopular man and not a very effective ruler. Valencia was a thriving and wealthy city, and was a grand prize for whoever could take it and hold it. The Count of Barcelona had decided to do that very thing, and had besieged the city. Rodrigo led his forces into the region, and it is a mark of his reputation that the Count of Barcelona immediately withdrew his forces back home again. Rodrigo then busied himself pacifying the region, shoring up the rule of Alcadir, and extracting the expected tribute from him. Then he received the news that all Iberia had been waiting for. The Almoravids had returned. Alfonso moved at once to intercept the invading Moorish army, and commanded El Cid to bring his forces to join those of the king. The approach of the Christians caused the Almoravids to withdraw, but Rodrigo had failed to join the king in time. His enemies at court suggested it had been a deliberate move to weaken the king. Rodrigo swore it was an honest mistake caused by the king changing his approach route without telling him. He even offered to prove his innocence through trial by combat. But Alfonso was furious and did not trust his increasingly powerful, his enemies might say arrogant, vassal. In punishment, the king confiscated his property and even, for a while at least, imprisoned his wife and children. This was a terrible affront and a sign of the king's immense displeasure. Rodrigo had been on the ascendancy, but now his fortunes were totally reversed. Some of his supposedly loyal knights began to drift away from him, sure that his days of glory were over. It's easy to be confident when things are going well in life, but it's how you respond when everything goes against you and you're at your lowest point that really reveals who you are. Rodrigo could have kept quiet and bided his time, trusting that when Alfonso needed him again, he would be welcomed back into the fold. But El Cid was truly a man of action, a man who took his destiny into his own hands. Reunited with his family again, El Cid raised his forces and in 1090 struck out along the Mediterranean coast from his winter quarters towards Valencia. His army moved from town to fortress, extracting payments from the local rulers in exchange for leaving, including from Al-Qadir of Valencia itself. These local Moorish rulers were all under the protection of either Castile or Catalonia, and the Count of Barcelona sent an army to stop El Cid. They clashed in a pine forest in the mountains, and El Cid was attacked from two directions at once. Surprised, Rodrigo fell from his horse and was wounded on the ground while the battle raged around him. Once again, however, his leadership meant that his men's morale held and they emerged victorious. More than that, he captured the Count of Barcelona and all his leading vassals, as well as the baggage train. It was yet another incredible victory, enriching El Cid and his loyal men and allowing him to continue to dominate the region. In 1091, Alfonso marched his army south to Granada against the Almoravids, and Rodrigo was urged to join him. Not only did they not manage to bring the Moors to battle, the king and his wayward vassal were not reconciled. After their last falling out, Rodrigo had essentially usurped the king's position as protector of Valencia and had diverted its tribute into his own purse. Alfonso was angry that El Cid was acting more like an equal than a subject and attempted to have Rodrigo arrested. Instead, the Campeador escaped. You could certainly see this inability to humble himself before his king as arrogance. But Rodrigo felt he had done no wrong, and indeed he was the one who had been wronged by his master. El Cid bringing his army to support the king was a gesture of goodwill, but it had been thrown back in his face. Now they could not be reconciled. Indeed, Alfonso sought to take Valencia for himself, making alliances with Genoa and Pisa for hundreds of ships to make a joint assault on the city by land and sea. Seeking to reimpose his authority on the region, it was as much a campaign against El Cid as it was the Moorish rulers. What could El Cid do? His army was now outnumbered in Valencia, and he could not wage war directly against the king. But equally, he could not sit back and watch Alfonso take the prize. So, while Alfonso settled into his siege, El Cid responded by brazenly invading Castile. He targeted in particular the lands of one Count Garcia, his most prominent enemy at court, the advisor who had been behind so much of Rodrigo's misfortunes over the years. These lands he ravaged, humiliating Garcia, who refused to meet El Cid in battle. He had shown that Alfonso could not protect his own lands from El Cid, who could strike where and when he wished. Victorious, enriched, and his point well made, Rodrigo withdrew. The king broke off his siege of Valencia in failure, and the Italian ships sailed away. Inside Valencia, the prominent Moorish citizens carried out a coup against the hapless Al-Qadir, who locked himself in his palace before disguising himself as a woman and attempting to escape. He was captured and executed, and a local man of the city took charge for himself. Sensing the time had come, El Cid turned his attention to Valencia. His army moved there in 1093 and began a siege. The poem of the Cid says he encircled the city entirely and intercepted any attempt to deliver supplies. No doubt his men also continually ravaged the countryside for miles around. The Almoravids sent a force to relieve the city, but perhaps wary of El Cid's reputation, they failed to offer battle and withdrew. And finally, in June 1094, after 9 months of siege, the desperate rulers of Valencia surrendered. And Rodrigo Díaz had made himself the ruler of one of the great cities of Spain. So El Cid took up residence in the palace as Valencia's ruler. The poem of the Cid says, quote, "There were untold quantities of gold and silver. All who took part became rich. The Campeador and his men rejoiced to see his standard flying from the highest point of the citadel." End quote. Valencia was beautiful. No city in Al-Andalus, said an 11th century Moorish geographer, has more perfect or more elegant walls. It stood in a landscape of abundance. Green fields of rice and wheat, citrus trees, vineyards, olive groves, and a beautiful lake teeming with wildfowl, fish, and eels. It was an extraordinary prize, but Rodrigo could not sit back and enjoy it. Immediately the Almoravids raised an enormous army and sent it to retake Valencia. The commander of the army was instructed to take El Cid alive and bring him back in chains. El Cid sent pleas for aid to the Christian kings, but the King of Aragon had died and his son was busy with the succession. Alfonso, no doubt still angry at Rodrigo, sent a small Castilian army to Valencia, but it did not reach it in time. So the Campeador found himself alone as the vast Moorish army approached. Valencia was deep in enemy territory and El Cid's hold on it was therefore rather precarious. What's more, many of the citizens were Muslim, who could not be trusted once their co-religionists arrived. All iron tools were confiscated, lest they be used as weapons against the Christians, and many of the men were driven out of the city altogether before the Almoravid forces arrived. Soon though, the enemy host was camped before the city walls. The Historia describes what happened next. Quote, "When Rodrigo saw that so vast and innumerable a multitude had come to fight against him, he was very apprehensive and remained inactive. Every day indeed, they used to go round the city shrieking and shouting with a motley clamour of voices and filling the air with their bellowing. They often used to shoot arrows at the tents and dwellings of Rodrigo and his soldiers, provoking them to immediate combat. But Rodrigo, stout of heart as ever, comforted and strengthened his men in a manly fashion, and constantly prayed devoutly to the Lord Jesus Christ that he would send divine aid to his people. There came a day when the enemy were, as usual, going round the city yelling and shouting and skirmishing, confident in the belief they would capture it, when Rodrigo, the invincible warrior, trusting with his whole mind in God and his mercy, courageously made a sortie from the city." End quote. In fact, there were 2 sorties that burst forth from the city at dawn. The largest was a massive frontal attack that drew all the attention of the Moors. But El Cid himself led a second force from another gate, rode out and around the enemy and fell upon them from their unguarded rear. The enemy army broke and fled, at which point thousands were cut down. Quote, "A multitude of them fell to the sword, others with their wives and children were led captive to Rodrigo's camp. Our men seized all their tents and equipments, they thoroughly plundered all the wealth they found there. Rodrigo and his men were greatly enriched thereby, with much gold and silver, most precious textiles, horses, palfreys and mules, various sorts of weaponry. They were amply stocked with quantities of provisions, and treasures untold." End quote. It was yet another incredible victory in the face of overwhelming odds. It was the most astonishing outcome, and news of it spread far and wide. It became the main event of the year for chroniclers, and it was the first battle where the Almoravids had been defeated. El Cid had shown that they were not invincible, and it gave a much-needed boost to the morale of the Christians of Spain. Still, he was isolated in hostile territory, and for the next few years he set to work securing his borders, taking fortresses, making raids, and imposing his authority on the region. In the winter of 1096-97, he met up with the King of Aragon to reinforce the frontier. But surprised by enemy forces and attempting to flee towards the coast, they found themselves cut off by the sea and surrounded by two Almoravid armies. Noticing that his men were afraid, El Cid mounted his horse and armed himself and began to ride among his army, greatly cheering them with a rousing speech. The Historia tells us what happened next. Quote, Rodrigo with all the Christian army fell upon them and engaged them in strength. At length, by God's clemency, they defeated them and turned them in flight. Some were killed by the sword, some fell in the river, and enormous numbers fled into the sea where they were drowned. End quote. He had won another magnificent and resounding victory, inflicting huge casualties and taking enormous wealth for himself and his men. He followed this up with more successful sieges, extending his dominion over the region through force of arms and by diplomacy. To secure alliances with powerful kingdoms, he married his daughter Cristina to the grandson of the King of Navarre. Their son Garcia would one day become King of Navarre himself. His other daughter Maria was married to the Count of Barcelona, presumably to deflect hostility from the Catalans Rodrigo had so often clashed with. Rodrigo and Gimina's only son, Diego, was tragically killed in battle, fighting for King Alfonso in 1097. Not much is known about Diego or the manner of his death, but his presence in the army of Castile suggests perhaps a thawing between Rodrigo and Alfonso. However, the death of his only son must have been a devastating event for Rodrigo. Not only is it the greatest tragedy for any parent, it also meant the end of El Cid's hopes for the future. We don't actually know Rodrigo's intentions, but as Prince of Valencia, it's likely he had hoped to found a dynasty to rival that of the grand counts and kings of Spain. Certainly he had elevated himself to their level in power and wealth, if not in name, and exceeded his contemporaries in fame and honours won on the field of battle. With his only son dead, however, he knew that all he had achieved in his life of glory would die with him. After this, he held on to Valencia for 2 more years. He was lord of the city for 5 years in total, but perhaps his life of action and his many wounds taken in battle caught up with his body. It seems to me that the tragic death of his son was a loss that Rodrigo's heart could not recover from. In July 1099, aged about 54 years old, Rodrigo Díaz de Vivar, the Campeador, the Prince of Valencia, the champion El Cid, died in his bed. El Cid was dead, but his journeys were not quite over. Valencia was now in the hands of his widow, Gimina, and she held out as long as she could as the Almoravid forces closed in. She begged King Alfonso for help, and in 1102 he approached the city with his army. But after surveying the situation from afar, he decided that the city could not be held, and he advised Gimina and El Cid's remaining men to evacuate. Bringing El Cid's body with them, that is what they did, and Rodrigo Díaz was returned to Castile for burial at the monastery of Cardena. Gimina lived quietly nearby for the rest of her life until at least 1113. The power struggles within and between the Christian and Moorish factions and the Reconquista continued for centuries. There were many great Iberian heroes, most of them kings, and momentous battles won. So why is it that out of all of them, El Cid became Spain's national hero? He's unusual because of the surviving account of his life, composed decades after his death, in the biographical Historia Roderici and the romantic, more fantastical epic poem of the Cid. Because detailed medieval narrative accounts of people are so rare, these sources bring the hero to life, and that's helped his legend to live on. Although there are other medieval chronicles of renowned figures like Alfonso VII, the poem is a truly special piece of medieval literature. But these early accounts were composed in the first place because El Cid was already considered an eminent hero. His contemporaries were well aware that an illustrious hero had been lost. A Moorish chronicler who hated El Cid wrote of him, quote, "This man, this scourge of his time, by his appetite for glory, by the prudent steadfastness of his character, and by his heroic bravery, was one of the miracles of God." End quote. The Historia says this of him, quote, "While he lived in this world, he always won a noble triumph over the enemies who fought him in battle. Never was he defeated by any man." End quote. The magnificent deeds of his life at once developed into legend, and the stories continued to be embellished with new and more elaborate chronicles, poems and ballads over the centuries. His legend was shaped by new authors who emphasised his piety, others his romantic qualities, until the historical El Cid also became a literary figure, appearing in plays for the theatre. Through these centuries of literary work, he emerged as a symbol of the Spanish Reconquista, embodying the struggle against the Moors and the effort to reclaim Spain for Christianity. Even the poem of the Cid portrays him as deeply pious and faultlessly loyal to his king. In truth, as we have seen, his actual life was more complex. He was a real man who negotiated difficult political realities and shifting alliances and made tough decisions for himself, his family and his loyal followers. His greatness comes in part because he was not faultlessly loyal to his master. He was a proud man who forged his own destiny, a destiny he accomplished through his ability to inspire thousands of knights through his leadership. Nothing that he achieved was inevitable, far from it. His accomplishments were incredibly unlikely. Every time something went against him, from banishment to being outmaneuvered in the field, he turned his misfortune to victory by sheer strength of will. By all accounts, he loved his wife and she loved him, demonstrated by her continued devotion to him after his death. He was peerless as an individual warrior, beating other champions in single combat. He was famed as a leader of men, driving thousands of knights to fight under his banner, and he had a perfect record as a battlefield commander. Even when the odds were against him, as they so often were, he not only never lost a battle, his victories were usually complete and spectacular. To me, it's easy to see why this man's life and deeds left their mark on Spanish history and culture, and why El Cid became an enduring symbol of medieval chivalry and Spain's greatest hero. If you enjoyed this story, please hit like, and if you want to see more videos like this in future, please subscribe to the channel. Thank you very much indeed to my patrons and channel members. By supporting the channel, you get exclusive content and ad-free videos. The links to join us are in the description below. Now, please watch this video on England's greatest hero, the sailor, explorer and privateer, Sir Francis Drake. Thank you for watching.